The following program features archival footage from World War II. All of the images are real. Some are extremely graphic. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Atlantic Ocean. This vast blue expanse is about to become a mass grave. In this film, we dive into the U-boat onslaught, and we look closely at Germany's attempt to starve Britain out of the war. From battleships to aircraft carriers, long-range bombers to submarines, the Battle of the Atlantic will become the longest and most complex naval battle in history.
We were instructed to fight total war. All foreign ships were torpedoed.
Carnage, absolutely horrific.
The war at sea for Britain was the decisive war.
Featuring newsreel of the time, rare and enhanced archive footage, and the testimonies of those who were there. This is World War II, Witness to War. England, October 1940. The Battle of Britain is drawing to a close. Adolf Hitler is facing his first major defeat of World War II. Great Britain's island position has proved advantageous in the battle for the skies, but Hitler doesn't accept defeat. He has a plan.
Great Britain, as a little island in the North Atlantic, has no sticking power on its own. What makes Great Britain a formidable opponent for Germany is the British Empire and long-standing allies like the United States.
It was absolutely vital for Britain to have access to the world market. So it was an importing economy. And there was always the danger of that Britain would be cut off from its supply lines.
And that's just what Hitler intends. He knows from experience what it will take to bring Great Britain to its knees. In fact, Hitler has targeted Great Britain's shipping from the very beginning. On September the 1st, 1939, despite clear indications that war is on the horizon, the SS Athenia set sail from the British Isles to Montreal, Canada, carrying 1,103 civilian passengers. While at sea, those on board are confronted by the new reality.
Went down to dinner in the evening. There was this notice posted up saying that war had been declared at 11 o'clock. We sat at a table with a man who'd been in the First World War, and we said to him, "What do you think? Do you think we're likely to get attacked?" And he said, "Oh, no. They'll wait till the ship comes back with armaments on before they do anything."
Little do they realise that lurking beneath the waves is German submarine U-30.
The Athenia crossed our path. We decided not to attack and instead to wait for dusk. At nightfall, we closed in.
On September the 3rd, without warning, a torpedo slams into the Athenia's port side.
The whole thing sort of rose up. It was dark. The electricity went off, and then she started to roll over.
Panic erupts. As the Athenia settles on her stern, men, women and children scramble to the deck. The lucky ones make it to a lifeboat.
They helped me onto the lifeboat, and then we went down. The lights were all out. It was really an awful eerie feeling.
We could hear the engine of the submarine. People say they're going to come up, going to machine gunners. I did a lot of praying, I must admit. And there was a lady nearby. I pushed her, no answer. She was dead.
I went up into the turret and saw the Athenia. The impression was she had been badly hit. Later, we became aware of the civilian passengers on board.
128 people, including women and children, are killed.
War news of these early days has been the criminal sinking of the Athenia. These survivors landing at Greenock en route for Glasgow are victims of Hitler's first crime by submarine.
Athenia tragedy on the 3rd of September 1939 was a mistake. So the German U-boat commander thought it was an armed merchant cruiser, so he didn't realize it was a passenger liner. But of course it demonstrated from the very beginning of the war that the German submarines tried to attack the British merchant traffic, tried to attack the British imports. So they put the finger on the weak point.
Britain needed food, it needed oil, it needed raw materials, it needed to import armaments, and all those came by sea across the Atlantic.
The Germans are fighting the Battle of the Atlantic to try to starve Britain of supplies and force Britain out of the Second World War.
The war at sea becomes a tonnage war, where British and Canadian navies must safely transport more tons of supplies past the prowling U-boats than the Germans can send to the bottom of the ocean. Within days of the Athenia atrocity, the British Admiralty adopts a convoy system. Each convoy consists of between 30 and 70 merchant ships. These will be Britain's lifeblood during the ongoing war effort. Now, non-military merchant sailors are thrown into a bloody battle at sea.
The importance of the merchant navy was crucial, there's no doubt about that, and we knew it.
The importance of the convoys is not lost on the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who coins the phrase, the Battle of the Atlantic. He later remembers that everything else on land, air and sea depended ultimately upon its outcome.
This was the main theatre of war. Churchill was the only one who knew it. He was afraid of us.
Adolf Hitler knows that if he's to stand any chance of defeating the world's most powerful navy, new technology is crucial. And his secret weapon of attack is his fleet of U-boats. In 1940, U-boat production goes into overdrive.
Our combat boats, the Type 7 class, were substantially more stable and more robust. They were much feared by the English.
The Type 7 submarines are also faster and can travel much further. They can dive to greater depths, and each sub carries up to 14 highly destructive torpedoes. With a low conning tower, their sleek profile makes them extremely difficult to spot from over a mile away, even in daylight. Hitler's trusted admiral Karl Dönitz is head of the U-boat fleet. He calculates that 300 of these U-boats will be enough to crush Great Britain. The Germans build 600. June 1940. Germany occupies France and Norway. Now, the Kriegsmarine can operate from every port captured across their growing empire, which allows it far greater access to the Atlantic Ocean.
The fall of France, the conquest of Norway, Holland, Belgium, changed the whole strategic position. Because if the British, as in the First World War, had been dealing with the German Navy stuck in the North Sea, it could easily have coped. But now the Germans are operating from Norway and from France. Suddenly you've got to cover an awful lot more sea.
Admiral Dönitz is a master tactician and the architect of a new strategy.
The U-boats hunted in packs. I think that first one that I went on, I think with 70 ships, and I think 40 of them never made it. It was so bad.
Dönitz commands his U-boats to stalk the convoys in so-called wolf packs.
Dönitz's tactics were to use his immensely powerful radios on the French coast to draw together wolf packs of German submarines to attack convoys all at once.
At night, under the cover of darkness, the U-boats surface in the middle of a convoy, creating confusion and causing ships to scatter.
We got hold of a convoy off the coast of England. Our boat sailed on the surface, and we then chose individual targets. We followed the convoy together with other U-boats, and none of them were left over. It was completely destroyed.
The human cost is devastating.
It was about 11 o'clock at night, pitch black. I was on deck. Suddenly, this destroyer must have seen this U-boat on the surface, hoping to get to the middle of the convoy. It must have been hit by a torpedo that hit the ammunition, and suddenly the whole destroyer blew up. I could see these lights bobbing about in the water where the men were screaming. And I think 80 Canadian seamen had lost their lives in that incident. So that was pretty horrific.
The British and Canadian merchant navies suffer heavy losses.
It was one of the most dangerous and certainly one of the most nerve-wracking branches of all our services, not an armed service. So these are ordinary sailors, peacetime sailors, in little, slow, old merchant ships at the mercy of submarines and air attack, sometimes carrying terrifying cargoes. I mean, imagine being in a petrol tanker, knowing that if you're hit by a bomb or a torpedo, the whole thing will go up.
All of a sudden, there was just a huge explosion. All we knew was woof, bang, wallop, and there was us, torpedo in the engine room. There was fuel oil spewed everywhere.
When the merchant sailors got onto those convoys, they knew they were getting on board ships that could very well be their coffins. For much of the early part of the war, those sailors had nothing to defend themselves.
Germany's U-boat campaign continues to terrorize the merchant fleets. And things are about to get even worse. May 1940. German naval intelligence hands the Kriegsmarine its first massive advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. It cracks the British Merchant Navy Code. Now, Dönitz executes his tactics with devastating effect. With the ability to track and predict the Allied convoys' movements, the Germans sink 274 merchant ships in a 5-month period. Only 6 U-boats are lost.
For a period, the happy time, as the U-boat commanders called it, it was possible to go out and sink Allied merchant shipping at will.
As soon as a German torpedo is fired, it becomes a waiting game.
Once it was out and moving, the stopwatch started to check if the distance was approximately right. If it exploded, then we had another success.
From beneath the waves, listening to the sinking ships is a haunting experience.
The sounds? Eerie. Absolutely horrible, to tell the truth. When a steamer sank, the remaining air whistled through the gaps and it howled and cracked. Underwater, you can hear every noise for miles.
The devastation increases when Admiral Dönitz sets a quota for his U-boat commanders. He believes if they can sink 600,000 tons of shipping a month, they'll starve Britain and squeeze her out of the war.
When we sailed into harbor, the pennant was flying, saying how many tons we had sunk. If the tonnage was high, then the commander was awarded the Knight's Cross. So we were enthusiastic. The band played, and the girls from the Hitler Youth were there. We were really proud when we sailed in.
Successful U-boat commanders of that happy time were used to demonstrate to the German people, we are so successful. What was important for the Germans was that the German propaganda created stars. The Knight Cross holders, Prien, Kretschmer, Schepke, these were really like football stars today.
U-boat commander Otto Kretschmer alone is responsible for sinking 200,000 tons of shipping.
I am listed in the Guinness Book of Records for the submarine war. Most successful in the world? Yes, that's why I receive so many letters. I am drowning in all the paper. They all want to have my signature.
Thanks to U-boat commanders like Kretschmer, Admiral Dönitz is winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and he's confident complete victory is within Germany's grasp. Early 1941. The Royal Navy needs something new to stand any chance of turning the tide. So it introduces permanent armed escorts, which are made up of several small warships organised and trained to operate together under one leader. They're equipped with cannons, depth charges and sonar. The U-boats face their first real challenge. The Royal Navy's latest form of sonar, known as ASDIC, uses sound reflections to detect objects under the surface. German submariners can hear the escorts above, seeking them out as the sound waves bounce off their iron frames.
The most unpleasant thing for us was the ASDIC ping. And when the sound rattled against our metal hull, we knew they've got us again.
When they find a U-boat, escort vessels unleash their depth charges.
We listened and heard bloop. Then it gurgled a bit, and the depth charges were on their way.
At a predetermined depth, the charges detonate, producing a powerful hydraulic shock.
If it came close, you can't imagine what it was like. Underwater reverberation makes a deafening bang. Not even a bomb on land produces a sound like that. And if there was damage, then wham! Valves would burst, the switches in the engine blew out, and the boat shook and became critical.
It's a terrifying prospect for those nervously waiting below.
When we were hunted with depth charges, that tore at your nerves and spirit. And if anyone says that he wasn't afraid, he's lying. Depth charges were truly nerve-wracking.
Still, Britain's ASDIC advantage doesn't last long. Admiral Dönitz identifies a crucial flaw.
Now, your ASDIC was no good against a surface ship. It was for underwater detection. Dönitz had originated a form of attack where the U-boat became semi-submerged, offering a very, very low profile.
From this semi-submerged position, the U-boats evade the ASDIC.
So that assumption that ASDIC would counteract all the U-boat threat was a false assumption.
The Kriegsmarine continues to wreak havoc, and it's not just the U-boats that threaten Britain's supply lines at sea.
I mean, a threat, of course, was also from the air. It wasn't only submarines. Aircraft, long-range German aircraft, sank an awful lot of ships.
Summer 1940. With the U-boat campaign hotting up, Admiral Dönitz is increasingly given air support. If the Germans are to win the Battle of the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe must become more heavily involved. With the ability to operate from their bases in Western Europe, the Luftwaffe provides greater reach over the ocean. German aircraft patrol the seas with devastating effect.
You can fire at one plane and probably drive it off, but when they come down one after the other, the writing's on the wall, they're going to get you.
By October 1940, as the Battle of Britain comes to an end, the Battle of the Atlantic rages on, turning the deep ocean, especially the mid-Atlantic, into a fertile killing ground.
It was particularly dangerous in the most remote areas of the mid-Atlantic, which could not be covered by air power.
The mid-Atlantic is beyond the range of British anti-submarine aircraft, leaving their convoys sitting ducks.
Well, the fact that we couldn't fly any aircraft, U-boats started to do an awful lot of damage. Unfortunately, there was an awful lot of people getting thrown into the water and ships were going down. It was carnage. absolutely horrific seeing these men in the water and not being able to do anything about it.
The Mid-Atlantic Gap becomes known as the Black Pit. And when the Germans introduce long-range spotter planes, the situation worsens.
The other thing that was a bogey to us was the long-range airplanes that used to shadow the merchant navy convoys, and obviously had contact and relayed either to base or direct to the submarine.
The escort vessels can't cope with these coordinated attacks.
Well, we're fortunate enough to have escorts, but of course the escorts couldn't look after 50 or 60 merchant ships, and unfortunately we had a lot of casualties.
The British manufacture smaller and more effective escort ships, but they're losing them faster than they can build them. Something needs to change if Britain is going to remain in the war. Washington, D.C. March the 11th, 1941. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt announces the policy of Lend-Lease, which allows Britain to take huge amounts of military supplies on credit with the promise of future repayment.
We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Roosevelt's pledge is music to Prime Minister Winston Churchill's ears.
Lease lend material is already coming over to this country in healthy quantities, and it's on the increase all the time. Convoys have been reaching port with greater regularity and with fewer losses than ever before. The arsenal of democracy, getting down to the job, is providing the tools to finish the job. Everything from food to planes. Make no mistake, America has promised all aid. America will give it.
But what Churchill really wants is for America to join the war. Oahu, Hawaii. Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. Without any declaration of war, Japanese fighters, bombers and torpedo planes swooped down from the sky to attack the US fleet.
The incredible attack Japan made on the USA in the Pacific, I thought the Japanese must have been absolutely crazy to do that, because where could it end? But that was mixed with relief.
America now has little choice but to declare war on Japan. Adolf Hitler has done all he can to avoid drawing America into the war. But as one of the Axis powers, allied to Japan and Italy through the Tripartite Pact, his hand is now forced.
When Hitler declared war on the United States of America on the 11th of December 41, I mean, now we can do something. But how can we attack America?
Hitler looks to the seas.
The German Navy suddenly was permitted to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare against the Americans.
Admiral Karl Dönitz develops a plan to target the US. It's called Operation Drumbeat. 5 of Germany's newest long-range U-boats head to America's east coast. New York City, January the 15th, 1942. British intelligence warns the US that German U-boats are prowling along its east coast. But the warnings are ignored, leaving the US Navy totally unprepared. German submarine U-123 enters New York Harbor's shallow waters. Nazi commander Reinhard Hardigan is within sight of New York City's famous skyscrapers, and he's thrilled by what he sees.
When I came first time to the United States, I was part of New York, and I saw on Long Island the coast, and I saw all the lights and motor cars. All the lights were on, the light ships, no dimming, no blackout, and so on. It was fascinating.
Americans refused to switch off the lights and black out their cities, and that meant that all of the light pouring out of New York lit up the ships in their harbors, and that made easy pickings for those German U-boat captains lying offshore.
The Germans strike, firing torpedoes into a 7,000-ton tanker. Commander Hardigan continues south along the coast. It's a turkey shoot.
All of that coast was lit up. I mean, along the Florida coast, for instance, all the hotels and so on. The Americans, of course, were starting to lose a lot of ships, simply because they could be seen at night, and the submarines, of course, could not be seen.
Before running out of torpedoes, Hardigan sinks American ships carrying 50,000 tons of cargo.
The period in which the German Navy could attack American ships with impunity, that was called the Second Happy Time by the German Navy.
During a 5-month period, over 600 US ships totaling 3 million tons are lost. And it's not just tonnage. The human cost is devastating.
Before the United States figured out how to conduct anti-submarine warfare properly, about 5,000 American sailors died trying to get vital war supplies across the Atlantic to Britain.
April 1942. The US Navy finally fights back. Coastal cities instigate blackouts. It operates daytime sailing only and introduces convoys and escort vessels, including the corvette. Corvettes are small, fast, and formidable U-boat hunters. Germany's long-range U-boats are withdrawn from America's east coast, and by mid-1942, it seems that the Allies are getting closer to defeating Germany at sea. The second happy time comes to an end. Moscow, USSR, June 1941. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin is stunned when Hitler's army invade the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. Germany now fights on 2 fronts, at sea against the Allies to the west and against Russia to the east.
When the Germans invaded Russia in the summer of 1941, it looked as though they were going to win. The Russian armed forces were badly prepared, badly led, and it looked as though the Germans were going to have a walkover. It was essential for Britain to try to keep Russia in the war, and hence to help to supply them. And this could only be done by sea, through Arctic convoys.
The US and Great Britain send supplies vital for Russia's war effort to the ports of Murmansk and Archangel, but the supply route through the Arctic Ocean is treacherous.
It was so cold that the circulation in our hands and legs was restricted, damaged the capillaries. It was torture. We had to do it.
The Murmansk run in the Arctic Ocean subjected crews to waves that were 60 feet tall, sometimes even taller. And because of the extreme cold of the Arctic, sometimes the water would freeze, and the next wave would freeze, and the next wave would freeze. And the ships became so encrusted with ice, they were unstable, covered in ice, and ready to roll over.
The weather is so cold, it can render the escort ship's guns useless.
Other escorts were in trouble with so much ice on them, on their guns and so on. The U-boats started to do an awful lot of damage.
The freezing weather isn't the only thing standing in the way of the convoys. German forces operating out of their new bases in Nazi-occupied Norway also threatened to destroy the Allied fleets.
The Germans were able to forward position air and naval assets that could constantly attack ships on the Murmansk run as they beat their way around the North Cape, as they tried to claw their way around the edge of Scandinavia to get to Russia.
If a ship is sunk, it's unlikely that any seaman will survive the extreme cold.
At the time he got a rope to someone, he was so cold, he couldn't grab it. An average time for somebody to survive in the water in temperatures 20 degrees below, which is what that was. 2 minutes, I think, is the maximum. An awful lot of people got killed then. An awful lot of merchantmen went down.
Arctic Allied convoys suffer crippling losses. But Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt know it's essential that Germany's war effort continues to be split between two fronts. The convoys must go on. The Icelandic coastline, June the 27th, 1942. An Allied convoy codenamed PQ-17 sets out for Russia. The convoy contains enough supplies to equip an army of 50,000 men. Once it's located by German spotter planes, the Luftwaffe scrambles to attack. PQ-17 prepares its defense.
The only air support you had was a cam ship. This is a merchant ship with a Hurricane on the forecastle, which would be catapulted off.
The cam ship is able to launch a fighter plane with its catapult, but it has no runway.
This poor pilot tried to shoot down as many planes as he could before he ran out of fuel. Then he had to dish in the sea and hope that he would be picked up, bearing in mind that if you emerged for more than 3 minutes, you were a goner.
With the aid of a US destroyer, it fights off the torpedo planes, taking one plane down.
In their clarity of Arctic summer, they suddenly lifted up from the horizon and looked like a huge swarm of mosquitoes. They flew at dead low level straight into the convoy. We did rather well. We shot a lot of them down. It was quite good. The air attack certainly repelled.
But out of the blue, a strange order comes in from the Admiralty.
The 4th of July, American Independence Day, the order came through for the convoy to scatter. Well, this was very unusual. I think this had only happened once during the war.
The reason for the order is that First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound believes the Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful battleship, is en route to intercept the convoy.
The worst danger of all was of big German surface ships like the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, breaking out into the Atlantic, because they would not just sink 1 or 2 ships, they could sink a whole convoy.
Pound orders the escort ships to return to base and the convoy to scatter. Now the merchant ships must chart their own course to Russia. But Lieutenant Leo Gradwell, in command of the escort vessel HMS Ayrshire, refuses to abandon his convoy. He disobeys orders and leads 3 merchant ships north towards the Arctic shelf. Gradwell's ploy is ingenious, if unorthodox.
Some of the ships went into the ice and put their engines in, put their fires out, and they stopped there for a week.
Gradwell orders his ships to wedge themselves in the ice, and the decks are painted white. Camouflaged in the ice, they lay low and wait. Thought lost by the Germans, they make a run to Archangel. Finally, on July the 25th, they successfully deliver their cargo. But the rest of the convoy isn't so lucky. 24 of the 35 merchant ships are sunk. Churchill describes it as one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. It highlights the dangers of the supply routes, and Arctic convoys are suspended, leaving Russian forces on the Eastern Front unsupplied and alone. Spring 1941. The British are still suffering in the battle at sea. German U-boats anticipate the Royal Navy's every move. Britain desperately needs better intelligence. But the Nazi ciphers used for their coded communications seem impossible to crack. This intricate coding system, known as Enigma, is a complete mystery to the British.
Machine cipher was thought to be absolutely secure, unbreakable. A specific type of the Enigma was then used by the German navies.
Then comes an unexpected stroke of luck. The Greenland Sea, May the 9th, 1941. An Allied convoy is attacked by German submarine U-110. Escort vessels respond, and the British corvette HMS Aubritia quickly locates the German sub.
We saw the Aubritia hurtling towards us. They had located us, and I turned to my radio comrade and said, "My God, Fritz, they've got us by the neck."
The British escorts release their depth charges.
Fired her second pattern of depth charges, and it pushed the U-boat to the surface. This is the dream of all of escort vessels, to see the U-boat coming to the surface. You really know you've got her. We immediately opened fire, Bulldog opened fire, and so did all the other escort vessels, onto the conning tower with every gun we had. The noise inside that submarine must have been absolutely desperate.
They were firing at us from all sides, from all boats in the convoy. But I have to say, when you've made it out of the boat, which was about to sink, and you breathe fresh air, you're mainly relieved. All the shooting doesn't faze you at that point.
As the German submariners abandon ship, the British spot an opportunity.
And then she didn't sink. Normally they set the detonating charges and down she goes, lost forever. But she didn't, she stayed on the surface. And that's when my captain decided, right, we'll board her. Or every boarding party always carries a telegraphist, and their duty is to go straight to the wireless room and take a reading of all the settings. He said, "Look, sir," he pointed this typewriter. And we both said, well, that looks an interesting bit of equipment. But there it was, the famous Enigma.
The Enigma machine could be the key to deciphering all German naval communications. It's taken back to Bletchley Park in England, where the great computer scientist Alan Turing and his team get to work. By June of 1941, Germany's supposedly uncrackable code is broken. At last, the tables are turned. Every movement of the once elusive U-boats can now be monitored.
Once it was possible to find the German wolf packs and find out what their orders were, then Allied naval intelligence was able to blunt the danger of the German wolf packs for a critical period.
The wolf pack tactics now play directly into British hands.
Because they used their radios so much, the British code breakers were able to figure out where Dönitz's wolf packs were hiding without the Germans realizing that their radio messages are compromised.
The hunters become the hunted.
First submarine we sank was in the Atlantic. We were in a hunter-killer force with a carrier. We knew that a U-boat was in the mid-Atlantic sending weather reports. We were homing on her radio transmissions, and gradually we got closer and closer to her position, and we then carried out a creeping attack. The submarine came to the surface. We had 13 survivors from that U-boat, including the captain, who was not a popular man with the rest of his crew because he was the first to abandon ship. The captain should be the last.
The Allied escorts now begin actively hunting German submarines. Improvised aircraft carriers and longer-range aircraft allow the Allied forces to plug the mid-Atlantic gap. The British also perfect an airborne surface detection system. Long-range aircraft can now locate surface ships from several miles away.
Then came the greatest losses. Once the English were able to locate us, and when we surfaced, the planes were there immediately.
By 1943, the happy time for the Germans is well and truly over. Allied code breaking, combined with technical innovations, tips the balance of power.
Allied technology got much, much better. You had new kinds of depth charges, you had anti-submarine torpedoes, you had a lot more escort ships, and you had long-range aircraft that could patrol the center of the Atlantic.
Admiral Dönitz is losing the Battle of the Atlantic. American mass production of ships, such as the corvettes, ensures plenty of supplies get through to Britain.
The war at sea goes on and the Battle of the Atlantic continues, but recently our shipping losses, though serious enough, have not been so heavy. One reason may well be the production of more and more corvettes to guard our convoys. Smaller, cheaper, and much quicker to build than destroyers, corvettes, thanks to the crews that man them, have been doing grand work, and a Nazi submarine is often sent to her doom by depth charge attack. Thanks to the corvettes, the convoy goes ahead in safety.
May 1943. 41 U-boats are sent to the ocean bed. One of them carries Admiral Dönitz's son, Peter. It becomes known as Black May by the Germans.
By the time of May 43, the Allied defense and escorts were so strong that it was just almost impossible for the Germans to attack Allied convoys.
Black May was the culmination, at last, of having the numbers of escorts we needed, enabling escort groups to work consistently as teams, knowing each other, the perfection of various weapons, and huge amounts of training. It at last came to fruition by May 1943.
Churchill's greatest fear, the U-boat fleet, is annihilated.
Losses among German submariners were higher than in any other branch of the armed services in any country in the war. And in the end, they were slaughtered. I mean, they were wiped out, and the submarines had to be withdrawn from the Atlantic.
Although fighting in the Atlantic continues until the end of the war, Black May proves to be the killer blow to Hitler's U-boats. But as the turmoil in the Atlantic settles, in Southeast Asia, it continues. America and its allies are going head-to-head with Imperial Japan in a brutal war of attrition.